This recording is going to be sent out to everyone who registered over the next couple days, so just keep an eye out from an email from us. Additionally, we're going to have a section at the end for questions, but we like to run this as a more collaborative effort. So if you want to throw in a question at any point while we're talking, feel free to do that within the Q&A, and then we'll try and answer it as fast as we can. If not, we'll just save it to the end. So without further ado, let's get started. Some of you may be familiar with SmartBear. Over the last couple of years, you've seen a dramatic sort of shift in what we're doing in the sense that we're continuing to grow and really make sure that we can help as many teams as we can in their software development journey from all the way from the beginning toward the end of the life cycle. And so we were founded in 2009, and since then, as I had mentioned, we've grown tremendously. We now have 11 global offices with over 6.5 million users, 22,000 customers. Those are paid licenses. We have 5 free tools, and we're continuing to invest in those because we see it as something that's really, really helpful to build the community and help people learn how to create better software. And so I kind of alluded to this earlier, but we have a product line that spans across the entire software development lifecycle. So all the way from design, whether you're using BDD with HIP test, documenting your APIs in Swagger Hub, managing all of those in Zephyr, creating, so you can use Service V, which helps you virtualize APIs and then run tests against those, Collaborator for peer review, and then Test Left as well as all of our test tools, one of which we'll be talking about today. So as you can see, that little icon, LoadNInja. Then we can use partners to deploy and then monitor with AlertSite, which is our synthetic monitoring tool. So just to give you an idea of the face behind the voice, my name is Saoirse Hinksman. I'm a marketing manager here at SmartBear, and I also have Keshav with me if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. I'm Keshav.
All right, so we will be talking today about a couple of things. What I really want to go over is why automation has become so popular. How did we kind of get to this point where this is something that's necessary from the market perspective, how you can get started, what some of those challenges are when you first initially try to get started, and then how you can automate this process within Jenkins and LoadNInja. We'll run through a quick demo to show you how you can do that. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll have time for questions. So why are teams looking to automate? This is kind of an interesting question. It's something that I think most people are not surprised by. Everybody has this idea of what they think that they're doing versus what they're actually doing and where they could be or where they should be. I think testing in particular is one of the areas that has typically been seen as a bottleneck in the development process. And that's because it does take time. And whether that means that just because it takes a lot of time doesn't necessarily mean that it's not important. Arguably, it's one of the most important elements in the software development lifecycle. And so because of that, in order to move toward more of an ideal standpoint where teams can spend more time planning their tests, creating these tests, executing them quickly, and then maintaining those tests at the speed and the scale that they need to in order to meet customer recommendations, customer needs, those features that people are asking for and they've been waiting on, you really, really need to be able to shrink that time and almost get rid of that bottleneck without costing your team too much time and effort. And so this kind of illustrates why teams are moving toward an agile workflow. And it's really more about the process. So it is a mindset where you're trying to make sure that everything you're doing is continuous. So rather than working through more of a waterfall process where you're waiting for something to end and then starting to take on the next task, you're able to integrate all of those together to really amplify the feedback that you get. And in doing this, you give yourself a little bit of flexibility for saying like, hey, we know this isn't working. Let's go back and fix it before it becomes a really big issue, as opposed to we're going to spend all this time running through everything and then we're going to test it at the end, where it becomes a problem to find, it becomes a really, really big problem actually to find like performance bugs in your code. And then it becomes a really difficult process to go back and remediate that. You miss release deadlines. There's just a lot of stress and drama associated with that. So being able to test earlier, get feedback earlier, and really shrink the amount of time that it takes to execute those tests is something that's been really, really valuable for teams. All right. And then Agile's call to rapidly iterate and get feedback often is really perfectly complemented by a strong CI/CD pipeline with a sufficient amount of coverage. And so I know that people are pretty much familiar with what CI/CD is, but I think it's helpful to really sort of pull apart the difference here when you're looking at this. So continuous integration really doesn't deal with the delivery of application to production. It only deals with getting new code into the master branch of a repository. And so when that code is pushed, the application is packaged up, built, tested, and then deployed on a test server. So your entire testing suite, as we'll talk about, should be running code when it's integrated, from unit tests to API tests to end-to-end tests. And then continuous delivery is actually the first level of getting that product into the hands of users often. And the actual act of deploying that branch to production is a manual exercise, or there's some type of manual check. Okay. So we had talked about automation. This is really the core of what we wanted to talk about today. So obviously those things all sound nice and grand in theory, right? But the big challenge is being able to actually execute this. And so CICD doesn't exactly solve the challenge of the time that it takes during the testing phase. So if your testing is still largely done by manual work, then your CICD effort will still take a long amount of time. It's a good ideal to have, but is it really saving your team that much time in the end? And are you really able to move at a quicker pace to get the things that you need to get done? And so by automating tests, you're able to cut testing times down and be able to reasonably integrate code with full test coverage. And then in old testing workflows, load testing specifically was always left to the end of the cycle, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later, with high expectations, and then it ends up having diminishing time windows. So when your code level performance bugs are found, the entire process becomes set back, and it really is frustrating, and it's something that teams deal with all the time, right? Where you have this deadline, you want to get it out, you're like, oh, everything was good, let's just test it, and you fully expect that that's going to be, or you would hope that it's fully fine when you run that test, but you realize there are some big problems. And so then it forces you into this situation where you're like, all right, I can either delay this release, fix it, and be confident about what's going to happen when it goes into production, or you can end up letting these big issues be slipped into production and then having to recall back everything later and remediate those issues. So this is something that sounds really great in theory, right? Everybody should be automating their tests. You know, if this is something that's so easy, why isn't everyone doing it? And so there's some really important things to realize. So even though everybody wants to move toward automation, it's something that teams are really striving for. It does end up saving people a bunch of time and money. It's something that's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to just immediately go and chase after and execute on. It does take time, and there are still significant hurdles, especially for load testing.
So, and the other thing we should mention over here is that automation is a means to achieving something. And as Sirsha mentioned, right, agility is something which many teams are aspiring to do over the last 15, 20 years, primarily because, again, consumers of applications, especially web applications, consumer-focused applications, require more features, especially quality features, to be delivered to them quickly and easily. So in order to achieve the speed as well as the reliability of the features that are getting deployed for these consumers to experience, you typically will automate different quality processes and checks and balances in place during your entire development and deployment workflows. And so to do this, however, you will need to essentially create a culture of continuous integration, continuous deployment to help in the agile testing and development within your company, right? And that starts from the culture. Once you create this culture, once you start educating people on the reasons why you have to go agile and why you need to start thinking about automation. Then it's about putting things in practice. And while again, like in the past 15, 20 years, when it's become relatively easy for development workflows to get automated, for functional testing workflows to become automated, unfortunately, the performance testing space has not necessarily kept up with the growing needs of moving fast and incorporating performance testing in an agile fashion, right? Teams, we've spoken to dozens of performance testing teams who want to be fast, who want to actually put it into their automation workflows. However, because of the cumbersome way in which performance testing scripts have to be written, that always still remains an ideal, a fantasy that can never be achieved. And so that is something we'll have to dig in and really think through how we can actually put this in practice if we want to become successful in performance testing.
That brings up a good point, and it's definitely something that we see all the time, right? Like this is, obviously it would save teams a lot of time. It would be really beneficial to the organization as a whole if you're able to automate, but it's not necessarily always the simplest thing to do. And the most common reasons why we find that teams struggle with automating load tests in particular is because test creation is really hard and it takes a lot of time. I'm saying this with the mindset of almost like what the market was before this year, right? Like we'll talk a little bit about why we created LoadNInja and how that helps. But if you're using a traditional tool, getting up and running is something that's really difficult and time consuming to do well. On top of that, there's this challenge between how accurate are your tests and how accurate is your analysis of those tests. And that really is dependent on the tools that you use, the way that you're able to interpret the data that you get back, all sorts of things. And these are things that teams really struggle with currently. Another element of that is this laborious test maintenance. So we talked about, or we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail later, but if it's hard to create the tests that you're making, it's even more difficult then to go back and be like, oh my gosh, I have to change this thing because the UI changed and I have to make sure that that matches and that everything will run correctly. And then eventually it just becomes this whole problem of like, you're not even testing anymore. You're spending all of this time just making sure that you can get to the point where you can run a test. And that sucks up so much time and effort where it becomes really, really challenging to try and figure out how can I do this in a way that I know that I can automate this and this test will be able to run without me having to be that involved with it. And then another thing that I wanted to point out was that most of the tools on the market today are pretty expensive by most teams' views, right? And so not only upfront is that cost very expensive, but if you're trying to host and maintain your own load generators, that's a lot of money as well. So we'll go a little bit in depth into that, but I quickly wanted to poll everybody. So if you guys want to participate, feel free. I'm going to throw it up there now and keep it open for you guys. But I wanted to kind of get your feedback and say, like, what are some of the things that you guys see that are challenging for you when you're trying to go into load test automation? What are some of the things that you guys feel are really inhibiting your ability to go fast and get to the point where you're trying to get to? So we're seeing a couple things come in. Okay, cool. I like it. It was just one answer at first, but now we're getting some differentiation here. Okay. So it looks like every time I think that I have an answer, more people respond. So I love it. But it looks like right now a majority of people are struggling with undefined performance requirements, a skills gap, and a lack of priority. So those are definitely interesting things. All of these are things that we've heard from teams looking to try and redo the way that they're testing, or people that are frustrated and kind of get to the point where then we have this long conversation about like, hey, what are you doing? How can we help you? And these are some of the top factors that have come up in our discussion. So it's good to know that other people struggle with those things as well. And we'll talk about most of these in the next couple slides too. So hopefully that will help you out, and then we'll get to the demo and you guys can see exactly how to do that. So the first challenge that people have is with test creation. And some of that's reflected in the skills gap that you guys have said that you struggle with earlier, where scripting is really, really tough, right? And the graph on the right is from a survey that we ran last year. It's a state of testing survey. And so as you can see, a staggering amount of people are still using scripting as the main form for their automated UIs tests, which is something that it's really hard to scale, and it's hard to scale well. And the reason being for load testing in particular is that there are a lot of dynamic elements that you have to go in and edit before you're even ready to play back your tests. So if you're using a protocol-based recorder, it just takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to validate that this test is going to work and that it's going to work in the way that you're intending it to work.
Yeah, so because it's essentially the way performance testing has evolved over the last 20, 30 years, right? A big reason why to this day people say lack of priority or there's a skills gap involved is primarily, as Saoirse mentioned, is the complexity involved in the actual scripting process. Traditionally and typically, what typical protocol-based load testing tools will do, which as the name suggests, will capture the protocol-based traffic. Right, this means it's going to capture all the traffic between the server and the client for doing those that go into simulating those transactions that you are trying to record in your script. So, for example, if say your transaction involves logging in, adding an item to your to an e-commerce cart, and then checking out, what you will do typically in performance testing tools to this day is to essentially capture all of the traffic between the server and the client. And this traffic, if you've ever seen like the network trace in, for example, your browser network trace client, you will see that it's a huge, voluminous amount of information. Right? It's huge. It's just one simple transaction will have like tens of all these like little things that go in to make sure that the end user sees those different items that go into that page. And then if your application has any dynamic components to it, which is most modern applications, right? If you have session IDs, if you have cookies, if you have authentication parameters and so on, you will essentially have to do a process of dynamic correlation, which is essentially trying to find out the first dynamic parameters, right? Which is all of those different things I mentioned, session IDs, parameter, cookies, and so on, in the first response that the server had sent to the client, which is a browser in this case, and then correlate that across all subsequent requests and responses. Because you want to do a playback, right? And playback will happen, which is playing back is essentially going through the same actions you just recorded. And that can only happen if you're able to successfully send the right session ID or cookies and all those dynamic parameters. Because if you're not able to send them, then the server will automatically give you an error, right? So this is a huge time consuming process. This is the reason why load testing to this day is seen as something which involves a really big and steep learning curve. Typically, teams will spend anywhere between several hours to a few days just to create a basic test script that can be played back. This is the reason why centralized performance testing teams exist in companies, especially big companies, because they know performance testing is important, but they also know it needs its own dedicated team because it just takes so long to become successful with. And this is also primarily the reason why performance test consultants exist, because it's really hard to do this by yourself, and you'll need to put in a lot of money to hire a consultant who is an expert in doing this protocol-based correlation process to become successful with it. Now let's add to the mix the other things, like for example, if your application has any sort of client-side Ajax or JavaScript, that essentially involves a lot more scripting in order to capture. Because again, if you're a protocol-based recorder, you're capturing the traffic between the server and the client. And for Ajax-based calls that are in the browser, in the client itself, like for example, you click a button, it shows you a pop-up, like a modal, right? And it's giving you a coupon code. Right? Those kinds of transactions, you will have to do some scripting in order to capture them because there's no traffic between the server and the client in those regards, right? So all of this is just it's a big, hard process. And coming from, we've all done some level of performance testing. All the people here, Saoirse and I have as well. And we know the pains, the challenges that teams go through in order to just create and become successful with creating a simple test script.
Those are really good points. And I think it actually bleeds perfectly into the next element of what we're talking about, which is accuracy and analysis. And so, as you can imagine, if it takes that much effort and energy and dedication to even just be able to get the script to play back before you even get it to run, trying to automate that process is something that's super daunting and almost kind of intimidating when you say, am I really going to be able to trust the results that I get back with this? And so teams really struggle with being able to feel confident in what they're doing and the results they get back, and then dissecting those results to then go have an actionable path for optimization moving forward. So it's worth mentioning that accurate isn't always an easy thing to define. A single page can exhibit a variety of different load times depending on the state of the servers, backing of the database, and a variety of other elements that, I'm sure you've all experienced. And so it means that every measurement of a page might be a little bit difficult, or might be a little different. So it's challenging to try and understand what your baseline of accuracy is. And so moving forward with this, it's really, really difficult to say, like, hey, if we're using a protocol-based recorder, is this really what we're going to be able to expect in production, or is this just something that we've kind of put all of our efforts and backing into and hope that this is what's going to happen when we get there?
This is, and to add to Saoirse's point, this is because traditionally load testing tools use load emulators to generate the load. Right? They don't, and load emulators are, as the name suggests, they're just like load emulation agents. They simulate load, and the way they build their builds is typically in the form of a WebSocket, or maybe they have like browser approximations like PhantomJS, but they might not necessarily mean they're not necessarily the real browser, right? So you can get a close approximation of what it could mean to have simulate load on your application, but they're not the real deal, right? So you will never necessarily have the full picture of understanding what is the actual end user experience when your application is put under stress, right? And some of the data you get back as well, typically, because of the way you script, which is in terms of requests and responses, the data you get back will also be in terms of requests and responses. Now, this is good information when you have request and response data, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the end user experience. That there could be other things that go into the end user experience, for example, like DOM load time and all the other navigational timings that exist that might not necessarily be captured in this picture. And then the time it takes for the testers to translate all of this information that is being presented, which is in terms of requests and responses, to the developer who is actually going to be debugging the performance issues, that translation time is going to be really high, because developers don't think in terms of necessarily protocol-based request responses. They think in terms of DOM load time. They think in terms of navigational timings, all of which essentially add to the bigger picture of debugging and ensuring that the application's performance issues are resolved in the quickest way possible when you're actually going through an agile automated workflow.
And so I think one of the best things to say to yourself when you're trying to go forward with your testing is really saying, like, am I using my application in the same way that my end users are? And if the answer is no, then there really isn't a point of testing at all. That's sort of the crutch of what we're going for here, is like, at the end of the day, we're all trying to deliver a great end user experience. All the features, all the capabilities, all of the added bug improvements, any of those things all roll up into one goal at the end of the day. So being able to test against that goal is something that's really, really important, and that people struggle with feeling confident about the accuracy of the tests that they get back. Another part of it that we didn't really go into as much is really understanding your load generators. So there are questions that come up like, how do I know it's accurate when it's running a lot of users? How do I know the load generator itself isn't overloaded and reporting inaccurate results? So those sorts of measurements are things that people struggle to feel confident about and need to double check and understand, like, how this is working in order to know or feel confident that I've tested this, these test results are accurate, and I can feel good about deploying this into production. And I kind of alluded to this before, but test maintenance is something that people really, really struggle with. And this is in part because, as we had talked about before, the actual creation of the original test is not easy. And so when you have to go back in and redo elements of what you've already done, it's pretty exhausting, because you get to the point where you're like, oh, I finally got it so that this test is ready to run. I feel good about it. I know that the results that come back are going to be accurate. And now I basically have to recreate the wheel and change this all over again to make sure that because one button moved, or because there's some element that's different now that I need to account for. It really is frustrating when you have to go back and almost feel like you're redoing the work that you've already done. And so this takes additional time and effort that you didn't even really want to be doing in the first place. And I think part of this is, like, we're in 2019, and this is the point where we're saying, like, this shouldn't have to be something that I have to do anymore. This should be something that is simple and maintainable and scalable. And finally, load testing can be expensive. It is very important, but most of the tools on the market today are not really feasible for smaller, middle-sized companies to be investing in. Or if they are, it does take a large chunk of their budget. And so that kind of stems from, I can understand or empathize, like, the lack of priority when you look at that number and you're saying, oh my God, you want me to dedicate that much of my IT budget to doing that? Like, isn't there another way around that? So it is really expensive, and that's just upfront. Depending on which tool you choose, you can also have additional costs to set up and maintain these load generators, which is just adds up over time. And most teams don't want to be burdened with costs like that. So it becomes a really big challenge when you're trying to say, hey, not only should I be load testing, I should be load testing frequently. I should be automating these load tests. These are things that it takes organizations a lot of time to look at these hurdles, stare them down and say, you know what, I know that these are going to be there, but I know that there's going to be a way around it. And I think a large part of that is the tools that you choose and how they'll fit and work for your team. But just to understand that, those are some of the things that we see as really big limitations or hindrances for teams to move quickly. So I just wanted to pull this up actually because it's more of just a proof point. This is from the same state of testing survey that we ran last year, but you can see that only 35% of people are continuously testing. And so what that means is that 65% of teams still don't run load tests for every deployment, which maybe that's not important for some teams, but for most teams, it's something that you really, really should be keeping in mind, being able to get feedback from that, and then continuously optimizing your performance moving forward. And I think a good thing to mention is, like, it's easy to abstract this, saying like, oh, like, I want good performance because this sounds positive for my team, or XYZ, this user will like it. But when you run up against statistics from people leaving your website, dropping out, abandoning carts, all of this stuff, this is what it comes down to, is like your ability to deliver on the performance standards that your users expect. Being able to do that comes from being able to test your applications and then iterate on those test results. So for 65% of companies to still be struggling with that, it's a pretty big deal. And it's something that you just want to keep in mind. I know that it's not easy, but it's definitely worth it. So the top benefits from automation, I'm sure that you guys have deduced this by now, but really you'll be able to move a lot faster. So the time that you spend in the testing phase shrinks. You're able to focus on things that are more important, whether it's planning, getting those tests up and running, and then maintaining those as opposed to trying to execute those tests. And then you can also increase your test coverage. So let's say that you're spending, I don't know, what did we say earlier, weeks trying to create one specific test script. If you're able to cut that down to an hour, think of all the other hours left in that week that you can go forth and create more tests, data drive those tests. It gives you the flexibility and the opportunity to continue working on things that you may not have had the chance to do before. And then additionally, because you're doing this in iterations and you're continuing to get feedback, your ability to fix things and get to a resolution becomes a lot faster. This is especially the case if you're able to have data that you don't necessarily have to retranslate into another format to share with other portions of your team. Okay, so deciding what to automate is not always the easiest thing. I think there's this idea that everyone wants to automate everything and that will just solve all of your problems. That most of the time isn't the case. So some good things to do manually would be ad hoc testing, where you don't really know what you're looking for, but you kind of just want to see what happens, figure out how things go, or if there's a specific random use case that you need to test for a short period of time, that would be a good example of what to test manually. Same goes with usability and exploratory testing. Things that you should absolutely be automating. First and foremost, load testing would be so beneficial. It's super difficult to try and load test manually with accuracy. for most companies. Same goes for regression testing. And if you're doing long-term testing, it'll take you a little bit to get your automated tests up and running and set up properly, but in the long run, you'll be able to save a lot of time, because if you're running these tests continuously, it doesn't make much sense to spend hours of your week every week trying to reset up these tests. Same goes for repeated execution tests as well. So just keeping those two in mind when you're trying to understand, okay, what should move to more automated versus what should I keep manual testing. So for load testing in particular, I know that we had talked about getting up and running with tests is really difficult. This is something that you can't necessarily automate too much, because there's going to be different requirements that you set up. So when you're able to actually spend time creating these tests, which we'll actually show you a faster way to do in LoadNInja in a couple minutes, so you don't have to spend all that time doing dynamic correlation and all of the sort of pain points that we had mentioned earlier. But then once you're able to have that test script ready, you can execute those tests and export those results immediately. And so automating that process really gives not only your team the flexibility to go forth and test more and continue to get feedback, but you can get that feedback to other portions of your team. So whether it's the development team, whether if you have something coming in from your ops team and you're like, okay, let me go recreate this problem and automate that, then those are the areas that you can go forth and continue to iterate on and really move faster with your process. So I know that a couple of people aren't familiar with what LoadNInja is, so I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background. It is the performance testing platform that we recently released. It runs on the cloud, and it uses real browsers at scale. So you can get up and running super, super easily. We'll show you how to record a test in a couple minutes, but basically you can point and click those tests. We record them in real browsers, and we replay them and run them in real browsers, so you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to go into that script, dig into things like dynamic elements like cookies or session IDs. Those will be automatically populated in the browser that we run those tests in. So it's something that's super scalable and super easy to get up and running. On top of that, because we run all of our tests in real browsers, the data that you're able to get back is directly coming from the browsers. So you can get those important metrics like navigational timings, DOM load, response times, any of the things that you need to go look at and say, hey, I know that this failed at this step because it's not meeting the SLA that we have. Becomes super, super easy. And then on top of that, we have a couple features that let you visualize and detect errors in real time. I know that most of you are probably familiar with Jenkins, but just to level set, Jenkins is an open source CI platform which helps teams automate tasks in their deployment pipeline. And so we'll run through how this works with LoadNInja. This is something that we recently released so that teams are able to automate their tests, move a little bit faster, integrate into their CI process really, really easily. So there are some other CI tools as well. Obviously, Jenkins isn't the only one, but it's what we see most often. A lot of our customers use Jenkins. A lot of teams out there use that as well. So this is the example that we're going to be running through today. But that doesn't necessarily mean that any of these are not as worthy. So just wanted to point that out as well. Okay. So actually, I might just save this until after the demo if you want to do that. Mm-hmm. Because this is just an overview of what we're going to run through, essentially how LoadNInja will work with Jenkins to then run those tests. And if you would like to, you can also send those tests into test management tools, one being Zephyr for Jira. So I'll skip over this. We can run through this after the demo. I think that might be a little bit easier. So I'll hand this over to Keshav real quick. If you want to run through some of the more tactical points of how to get started with LoadNInja.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Do you mind, Shalish? It's not sharing. Stop sharing your screen.
Yep.
Looks like I'm stuck. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And hopefully everyone can hear me loud and clear. So right now I am in LoadNInja. and I've just accessed the web applications UI, and what you're seeing right now is the projects view. Within LoadNInja, every single test asset, be it test scripts, load testing scenarios, or load test results, are all organized through the lenses of a project. Think of projects as folders, right? And within LoadNInja, you can create an unlimited number of projects. So I already have a project set up. It's an empty project that has, as I mentioned, you have the different tabs to organize different assets like scripts and test runs. So now for this specific demo, this is what I want to showcase. I want to first record my test script on a simple application. And in this case, let's say we want to load test an e-commerce application that allows you to buy pets online. And the specific transactions that I want to capture in this script is the ability to log in, search for a specific pet item, like maybe a poodle or a bulldog, and then add it to my cart, and then go through the checkout process. So that's the transaction I'd like to record. And what I want to do is I want to create a simple load test. And for this example, I'm going to create like a 15 virtual user load test. So with that said, let's actually go right into the recording, right? So as soon as I go into the project, you see this little button that's called that's labeled record. As soon as I click record, I'm going to be seeing this prompt. This prompt is going to ask me for the URL of the application that I want to test. So this is the specific application. It's called a pet store. And the pet store essentially allows you to search for different pet items, like say, I can search for a parrot, I can add it to my cart, and I can log out. Okay. 1 second. Let me make sure. Actually, what I will do, instead of going to the pet store, is use the actual SmartBear website. And I've gotten permission from the team at SmartBear to actually do a simple 10 virtual user test to see how the marketing website behaves. So let's actually go ahead and start recording our transactions.
So someone just asked why does the application request screen resolution at the beginning? And this is because then you can test based on different types of basically different devices. So while you can't specify the exact device that you want to test on, let's say if you want to see what your application or how your application will behave on a desktop versus a smaller resolution screen, you can do that as well. So that's why that option is there.
Yep. Perfect. So as Sarisha mentioned, so we can choose different resolutions. So I'm going to go with the 1366. So that said, I'm going to click Start Recording. As soon as I click Start Recording, what you're going to be seeing is the Instaplay Recorder. The Instaplay Recorder will essentially render the application that you're trying to record the transactions for in real time on the right side over here. You will see all the controls to control your recording on the left, and all the different transactions that you record on the application, right? Like, the clicks, the entering the form fields, going through different pages, all of that is going to be captured over here. So let's actually go ahead and start recording some of these transactions. Let's say I want to go to the login flow. I'm going to click login. I'm going to search for a different pet item. Let's say I search for poodle. I'm going to add it to my cart. And then let's say I click log out from here. So I've essentially gone from logging in, searching for a different pet item, and then logging out. Simple set of transactions, right? Now, notice again, all the different pages that I've traversed through, right? So there's different pages like the sign-in page, the checkout page, the search page, and so on, have all been captured as their own step. And each step has different transactions underneath them, right? So you have different mouse moves, click events, and so on that have all been captured as an action or as an event under their specific step. So this can essentially allow you to go in and you can modify these events, you can change what they're pointing to, and of course, I'll show you how you can data drive them as well. So in this example, let's actually go ahead and change the think time, because I was talking during my recording, right? From recorded to minimum, right? So this is essentially going to change all the wait times that we've had between different events to the lowest amount of time possible in a browser, which is 100 milliseconds. So now, once you've recorded all of your transactions, the most immediate next step as a performance tester for you to do is to click playback, right? And when you click playback, you want to ensure that all the transactions have been successfully captured. This is where, as we mentioned, like in a typical protocol-based recorder, you would have to go through a lot of correlation, dynamic programming, and so on in order to make sure the dynamic components of the requests and responses are accurately captured and sent across all subsequent requests and responses. With LoadNInja, we abstract all of that because we are essentially recording transactions from the client's perspective, from the browser's perspective. So you don't have to go through the protocol. You think of, you simulate user behavior, the transactions from the end user's perspective. So let's click playback now. And notice now that we're clicking login. I'm going through all the different items, right? Like, for example, putting in my username and password. And you'll see, again, like all the different items that are being played back. You can see exactly which item they're on. And there you go. You can essentially go from step one all the way till the final step and make sure that these transactions have been successfully captured in a matter of minutes without doing any programming or dynamic correlation. And now the powerful, unprecedented thing over here is that you can scale this script across tens of thousands of real browsers, which we'll show you again in a minute. So now that I've actually captured my transactions, typically, in a real-world load test, you can be rest assured that not all 100 virtual users will be searching for the same pet item. Not all of them will have the same login information. So what you can do over here is you can actually data drive some of these tests. So you can attach a CSV file that contains, a list of, in this example, like a list of pet items, like poodle, parrot, fishes, and so on, all of them that you want to, that these different virtual users can pick up and simulate in their load test. So let's actually go ahead and do that. I'm going to click import data bank, and this is where it's going to ask me for an external CSV file. So I'm going to search for that specific file. It'll give me an option to parse it. And from here, I can get a quick preview of the items that are present in this file. Right? So you see all the different items that are present. And from here, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be mapping the input that I had in my script, which is poodle in this case, when I was searching for that item. And I'm going to map that to the specific column over here, which is a search animals column. And then I'm going to click Save Mapping. So now, let's actually go ahead and click Playback again.
So while this is playing back, someone's asking if you can do this inside of their firewall. Yep. The answer is yes. So I don't know if we want to go more in depth with this, but there are a couple different options that you have for running tests against your application inside your firewall. Yep. The most popular one would be getting a dedicated IP, which we offer for our customers. It's super simple. Then that way you just have to whitelist one IP versus a bunch of dynamic IPs as well.
Yep.
And another person is asking if we can import a data bank via database query. I know that you can use data. You can definitely data drive your tests. I'll forward that over to you, actually, if you want to get more in depth with that.
Let's discuss that in a second. Okay. So notice that when we did the playback, this time we searched for a different item. And we actually searched for a Manx instead of like the poodle. Right? This is because it's picking up items from the external CSV file. Now, before I continue forward, I do want to add one thing, and I want to add a validation. Think of a validation as essentially something that's like a little check. And you can add different validations, like you can ensure that the step contains a certain text item, whether you can make sure that that step takes a certain amount of time to load, or you can do another level of validation, which is essentially making sure you can add some JavaScript to do more complex creative validations. Like, for example, in this e-commerce application example, you can ensure that the sum of all the items in the in the final cart equals the sum of the individual items, the prices of the individual items. So you can do a lot of creative JavaScript-based validations. So in this case, let's just add like a basic example. So let's call this a fail validation. I'm going to add a validation that intentionally fails. So I'll show you how the load test actually works. And in this case, I'm going to say page contains the word puppy. And I'm going to add it to the final pet, to the page over here. And let me add another validation, which I know will pass. I'm going to call this the pass validation. I'm going to search for the word dogs. I'm going to add this to the final pet store again. All right. So I've added 2 validations over here. And now I'm going to click save. I'm going to save this web test. So I'm going to call this a test script. So from here, once I save this, the next step which I'll have to do is I'll have to create a load testing scenario. So think of a load testing scenario as, you know, a configuration of your load test itself. This is where you add the test script. You can define how many virtual users you want to run, and I'm going to call this, say, scenario example. You can define how long the test should run for. In this case, I'm going to leave this as 1 minute. I'm going to change this to minimum, the playback time. And you can also define if there's an error, how do you want to handle this error? Right? And we have a new innovation that we bring to the market, which is the ability to actually debug client-side issues. So meaning like if there's any sort of error, in this case, if you recall, we've added a validation that will fail. What we will do is, because we use real browsers, we will essentially hold the connection with the browser live in real time for you to go in, log into the JavaScript terminal and start interacting with the web application, right? And start debugging it from the client side. So it's really powerful, and this just allows you to like roll up your sleeves and get to the bottom of what's causing the issue from the client's perspective, you know, depending on the criticality of it. But because I'm going to talk to my automation workflow, I'm not going to select this option. And instead, I'm going to say, if there's an error, I want to stop that iteration and go back to create another iteration again. Once that's done, I'm just going to click save. So I've just saved my scenario. I've noticed that I have not run the actual load test, because what I want to do is actually I want to run configure this the actual execution of the load test as part of my build process on Jenkins. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So this is Jenkins right now, and you know, for everyone who's not familiar with Jenkins, Jenkins is a CICD pipeline that allows you to essentially create these workflows, these pipelines, and they have a lot of different out-of-the-box plugins that allow you to essentially automate many of your testing, deployment, and development workflows. So now I'm just logging in, and by the way, it's open source, so completely free. Once I'm here, you know, you can see a list of all of my projects. What we would recommend before you get started with using LoadNInja for Jenkins is to first download the LoadNInja plugin. So to do that, just go over here, go to Manage Jenkins, and over here, click on Manage Plugins. So you will essentially be able to find the LoadNInja plugin to download. I already have that, so just search for LoadNInja over here. We already have it installed, so that's why it's showing up as empty. So I have the LoadNInja plugin right over here, right? And it's completely free, so you can just now incorporate LoadNInja into your build process. So now that you've added this, all you have to do is go ahead, create a project, and add this to your build step. So let's actually go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to create a new project. So I'm going to click New Item. I'm going to click Freestyle Project, and let's call this as testing build. Right, I'm just giving an example for this, and I'm going to click OK. I can give a basic example, so I can just call this an example for my test automation webinar. You can point this to an SEM version, source code management tool. I'm going to not go through that motions for now, and let's just choose LoadNInja in the build process. Over here, it's going to ask me my API key and also the specific scenario ID. So you can get both of them from LoadNInja directly. So coming back to LoadNInja, to get your API key, just go to your settings. Every user gets an API key. Right, so go to settings over here, click on API keys, and you essentially have the ability to copy this. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it over here. And then it's going to ask you for your specific scenario ID as well. So remember, I created a scenario example over here. You can get the scenario ID right from the URL. So just copy that over here and paste it over here. That's all it takes. Literally download the plugin and just put in these different information. And you can make sure this key is valid by clicking Validate API Key over here, and you'll get the notification saying that the API key is valid. From here, You can also do some creative things like, adding pass-fail criteria for your load test. So, you can say, for example, that you want to make sure that this test passes if the error percentage is less than, say, 10% or 20%. So in this case, let me say I want this test to pass if the error percentage is less than 10. If it's greater than 10, when the load test is finished, it'll give me a notification saying that this load test has failed based on the criteria that I've added. I can also define, for example, the pass criteria based on how long it's taken for different steps to execute. So the average step duration, which is the time it takes to execute a specific step, if that is less than a certain amount, right? So you can define all those criteria. It's up to you. So now I'm just going to save this, and now let's just build now. So now you'll notice that it's actually building the project. So let me click that, and you can actually see the status of the actual project in the output. And over here, this is where you're going to get information saying, what is happening in the scenario. So here you're saying that the scenario is the scenario example, the creation date, whether it's a duration-based test. Now you're saying that the checking if the test is still running, and the test status is saying starting the servers. So LoadNInja is now spinning up all of those servers. And the beauty of this is, as Sirsha mentioned in her webinar, all of this is real browsers. So be it 10 users or 10,000 virtual users, each virtual user corresponds to a real browser that that LoadNInja will spin up automatically without you having to do any of the server maintenance or setup. We will spin that up for you, and you can be rest assured that this is the most truest and accurate representation of load on your web application. So you can quickly see as well what is happening by just clicking here. And you'll see in the UI as well that there's a test that is actually running over here. Right? And you can see, of course, you can always see the test input over here as well as it's running. So this is going to give you in real time what is happening. And you're seeing that now this is now part of your automation workflow as well. So now you're seeing, for example, that the test status is running. And now every 5 seconds, once the test has started, you will be able to see in real time what the output is happening as well. Right? And you can, of course, see that as a plain text information as well. So this really is how simple it is for you to go ahead and configure your load testing as part of your CI/CD pipeline. Now, I do want to mention over here that, remember I mentioned that we have API keys? Well, we have a public REST API. So the cool thing about this public API is you don't have to necessarily go through a CI/CD pipeline to automate. We give you the full capabilities of doing that from our public REST API. So you can actually be very creative and flexible in order to use this API to programmatically drive your load testing in whatever scenario you want, right? If you're using Travis, if you're using Bamboo, you can just call all of them through by essentially making a simple API call in all of those different pipelines without having to go through specifically Jenkins, right? If you want to go do all of this in a script in your code level as well, you can just simply call this API as well if you're doing something manual by yourself or if you have your own build process set up within your company, right? This REST API will give you all that capabilities to do that. And so in this REST API, you can simply create a new scenario and run a load test all programmatically. Right, so it doesn't necessarily have to be Jenkins, and this is a public REST API. So anyone within our anyone who's a customer, or if you're trialing the platform, you can always use this as well to get a sense of how LoadNInja is doing. So now going back to Jenkins, notice that you're seeing all of the results getting populated in the console output over here. So this really is how simple it is in LoadNInja to create a test script, attach it to a data bank, add validations to it to make sure you have the right checks on every step. And then, configure your load test, and then point that specific load test you've configured to your CI/CD pipeline, specifically over here, Jenkins. And then now you've just incorporated performance testing in your automation workflow, in your build process over here. And anytime your script changes, it's super simple for you to just go back to LoadNInja. So in this case, let me go to LoadNInja over here, open up a test script. Right? And very simply, I can just go to the specific input and modify it in case my application has changed, in case my UI has changed. Right? So this way, you can make test maintenance, the script maintenance, a simple and easy and straightforward process as well. So This really concludes the entire demo of showing how you can use LoadNInja to not only create scripts that are instantly playable out of the box, but also incorporate them into your CI/CD pipeline and essentially automate your entire build process through Jenkins. And of course, if you want to go beyond that, you can always use our public REST API with a simple API key that we provide to every user to programmatically drive your load test in whatever custom configuration that you have, be it through a CI pipeline that you use through Travis or Jenkins, or something you've developed in-house as well. So I know we have a few questions, so let me...
Yep, I can read them out, and then we can answer them. So do we have any plans to test on different browsers?
Yeah, great question. So luckily for us, our proprietary patent pending technology is essentially Selenium under the hood, right? So this means that we can easily extend to other browsers as well. So right now we're running on Chrome for all the load generators, headless Chrome, but that doesn't mean that we cannot run it on other browsers. We just haven't, for now, invested in that primarily because 85% of the market right now uses Chrome, and we thought, let's use Chrome for now. Let's add as many capabilities as we can in order for the scripting and for the load test analysis. And once that's done, let's hammer in on adding different browser capabilities on that.
And then how many browser sessions can be opened within a minute? Oh, sorry. I totally made that up. That wasn't even the question. How many browser sessions can be opened with one machine?
Oh, so that really depends on the scale you're looking at. So because of, that is like, we can talk about that more, like, because it's like something that is proprietary to SmartBear. Right now, for example, depending on the scale of load testing you're doing, say, for example, 10,000 browsers could mean like it's different for different machines, whereas like 10 browsers could mean different for different machines. So it really is depending on what scale you're looking at. And specifically, if you want to go into the details of how much it is per server based on the scale we're looking at, then we can take that discussion offline, because I know that it is something which SmartBear LoadNInja is the first tool that allows you to do this out of the box in a scalable fashion without necessarily relying on you, the tester, or the user to set it up manually on your local machine. So it is something. It's a bigger discussion that we'll have to think of to share.
Okay. And then are there plans to create plugins for other CI/CD tools?
Yes, absolutely. If you can just send us a message to Sirsha and chat telling us specifically which CI tool you're looking at, we'd love to have a discussion with you. In the meantime, though, you can do this process using the public REST API, because every CI tool right now has a plugin to call an API. Right, so you can still use Bamboo or Travis or anything else, have a plugin in the build step that allows you to call an API and just put in the API key and that specific endpoint for the test run. So this is, for example, the post test run endpoint, and you can run this in your CI pipeline. So the plugin that'll help improve this process we will work on, but you can still right now today do this as well using the LoadNInja public API.
Okay, and then one of the next questions is, what about server monitoring?
Great question. That is something that we're actively looking at right now, and our hope is to get that within the next 1 month.
And how can they export the results of a test run? What's the output?
Yeah, so right now the output is in terms of PDF or PNG. We are right now working on a feature that will allow you to export that as CSV as well if required, so you can do some more analysis. But that said, we actually can provide you with the ability to export all the data, right? The 5-second resolution data, meaning when you're generating those graphs, we give you the results in a 5-second resolution time, something that is also something very unique from a browser perspective, and it's all real browser-based information. This information is 5-second resolution information you can actually get from the API directly from the test runs raw stats endpoint. So this endpoint will allow you to get that 5-second resolution-based data that you can then use to paint your own custom graphs or do some really creative number crunching with this. So that's something you can always do as well.
Okay, and then can you integrate this tool with any monitoring tool like Dynatrace?
Right now, we don't have that. Our plan is to essentially first create our own server-side monitoring, and then once that's done, integrate that with a tool like Dynatrace.
And then for more, hold on, let me open the chat really quickly, because
And just one last thing, Saoirse, before I dive into the question. Notice that right now the test is finished and you got the status as failure. This is because we added a pass criteria saying the test should only pass if the number of errors have been 10%, less than 10%. And if you recall, we had added a validation that was bound to fail because it was searching for the word puppy in the final script in the test. So this was intentionally failing because I wanted to showcase how LoadNInja handles errors and failures. And so, based on that, we realized that the load test has failed because it did not meet all the pass criteria that we had defined in our load test itself.
So I know we're running right up on time. I'm just going to launch this poll so that if people are interested in getting a more personalized demo and want to run through some of their use cases, they have the chance to raise their hand. So I just launched that. If you would like to do that, that's something that's interesting to you, feel free to respond to that. Additionally, I'm going to be sending out this recording. It's going to come from my email. So if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, anything, just wanted to say hi, feel free to respond to that, and then I can get back to you with any of the questions that you have. So other than that, thanks for hanging with us. I know that we're 2 minutes over. I really appreciate it. I hope that this was helpful for you. Again, feel free to reach out to me at any time. All of my contact info is on your invites, and they'll be on the replay session as well, which I'll email over hopefully tomorrow, but if not, latest would be the end of this week. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.